synthetic Sable brushes. What are they like to paint with, and are they any good? In this video I'm going to be reviewing the new SAA Imitation Sable brushes, and I'm also going to be painting a yellow butterfly. So welcome back to the channel. If we haven't met before, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find watercolour and mixed media, art tips and techniques, plus business and social media training for artists. So please do consider subscribing. It's free, and if you ring the little bell notification button, then you'll get notified every time I have a new video for you. When you first start learning to paint watercolours, somebody sooner or later will tell you that you must buy a Kolinsky Sable brush, that they are the best brushes, the best quality, and that you will get the best results. That's what people said to me, and so I did buy one. I thought Kolinsky Sable was just a brand name. I found the brush itself very expensive and rather floppy. I've always preferred the spring of a synthetic brush, but it was only after a few years that I discovered what Kolinsky Sable actually is. It's not a brand name, it's an animal similar to a mink, and it's not a byproduct of the meat industry or anything like that. I mean, I don't eat meat anyway, but it's actually part of the fur trade. We've all heard the horror stories about the fur trade, and from that point on I was never prepared to buy a Kolinsky Sable brush again. Now, whatever your brushes are made from and whatever you find out about them, please don't throw them in the bin. That's the least environmentally friendly thing that you could do. So the best brush to use is obviously the one that you've already got. So don't throw them away. But for me, I'd rather paint with the broken end of a stick than buy a Kolinsky Sable brush, no matter what sort of results it gave. And I've been able to manage perfectly well without them. Now this week the SAA sent me these to try out. So these are the new SAA Imitation Sable brushes. I must point out that I did not pay for these. However, the video is not being sponsored, and they're not paying me any money. They just sent me the brushes to try out because occasionally they send me products to give a go. And I thought to myself, what can I paint with these? There's lots of different shaped brushes here, some of them that I don't normally use. So I think I'm going to paint a butterfly because I've got some big areas, I've got some fine detail, and I've got some background. So do watch along with me as I try out all these brushes. I'm not even sure I'm going to like them because, as I said, if they're a synthetic sable, then perhaps I'll find them floppy like I did with the sable that I bought years ago. So I'm going to give you an honest review and try each brush out, and we're also going to paint along and do a lovely yellow butterfly. So you can paint along with me, or you can just watch, and we'll see how I get on with these new brushes. So we're going to have a look at these brushes, and I'm also going to paint a butterfly. Now, I'm not going to paint it in real time, but I am going to show you every stage of it. So if you want to paint along with me, what you'll need to do is pause the video at the end of each stage so you can let things dry, and also just continue on with the painting a little bit longer than I am. But I am going to show you each stage of it, so you'll still be able to follow along if you want to. So I've got here, I've got a 3B pencil, and what I want to do first of all is find the center of this piece of paper. So what I'm going to do is just put a ruler across and just find roughly where the center is from each side. And the reason I'm doing this, the ruler's not quite long enough, is it? The reason I'm doing this is because I want my butterfly centered in the middle of the page. Now, I've got a book of butterflies. This isn't going to be any specific species really. I'm just taking a bit of inspiration from several that I've got on the page, so there's no worry about copyright infringement. If you want to do, you know, a specific butterfly, then you'd have to look up the species, etc. But I just want to make a pretty picture today and try out these new Imitation Sable brushes. So I'm going to find the center of my paper, and then I'm taking a right angle up the middle. Now these are just guidelines because, as I said, I want the butterfly to sit around the center of the paper. Now you often find with butterflies that the body is far, far smaller than the wings. So I'm going to sort of make some little marks for whereabouts the body's going to sit. And then we're going to take the wings out from there. Now don't worry about getting the wings exactly symmetrical, because just like people, butterflies are not completely symmetrical. You know, the wings may vary on each side, and the butterfly may not be laying exactly level. But if you do want to just check that they're at least roughly the same width, then once you've taken your wings out, for instance, you can perhaps use this center line and you can measure how far out. You know, you don't even have to use a ruler. You can just make a little a little measurement with your pencil like this and just check that he's roughly symmetrical. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my butterfly now. So I'm almost there with my butterfly. What I've done is I've made the lines a bit darker than I would normally have done, because otherwise you won't be able to see them on camera. But when you're drawing yourself, try to keep your pencil lines as light as possible, only as dark as you need to be able to see where to put the paint. Now I've got an overall butterfly shape, but there's a few things I'd like to do. So if we have a look at my my book of butterflies, there's a few things going on here. So you've got the colours and things. You've also got a lot of these sort of scallop shapes here going on. So I'd like to get some scallop shapes. I'm going to go for yellow, like this one or this one. And I'd also like to get some of these fine veins. So I'm going to put the fine veins in now, and also some of these scallop shapes. Now, if you've got a shape that has a wiggly edge like that, and this goes for anything that you're drawing, rather than sort of try and go round and round and round and follow the shape, you know, just by eye, you'll go offline every time. So what you want to do is just get an overall shape, and when that's correct, then you can go in from there, and I'm going to go in from there, and I'm going to start making those scallop shapes. So next I want to think about colour. I want kind of a warm yellow with some highlights of an orangey yellow. So I'm going to be using cadmium yellow light and cadmium yellow deep. These are Talon's Rembrandt colours. In fact, I think all the ones I'm using today are Talon's Rembrandt. That's not the only brand I use, but I've got probably more of those than any other brand. So it just so happens that the ones I'm using today are Talon's Rembrandt. So I'm also going to use Payne's Grey, which will be good for the areas that look almost black. And I can also mix it with yellow to make some greens. I'm going to use cerulean blue because it's one of my favourite colours. We can get a nice background in with that, and mixing it with some of the yellows that we're using in the butterfly. The last colour I'm going to use, I want these veins to be brown, but not too sort of in your face and not too warm. So I'm going to be using sepia. If you haven't got sepia, it's a bit of an unusual colour. If you haven't got sepia, you can make it yourself from ultramarine and burnt umber. So let's have a look at these brushes. So the first one I'm going to use is this size 12 Imitation Sable flat. Now this is a small flat brush, and you might have noticed from my other video on mistakes of using brushes is that I'm not generally a fan of small flat brushes for watercolour painting. Now this is a lovely brush, nothing wrong with it. I just sometimes find that with some of my students, especially if they've come from a background of oil painting or acrylic painting in a loose style, they're sometimes very wedded to a flat brush like this, a small flat brush. It's not the best brush for the majority of watercolour painting. It makes very specific flat edged marks. So what can we do with this brush? I think we'll make the background with this brush because it's perfect for that. The flat edge is going to allow me to go round the butterfly, and I should get some interesting shapes from that nice square end. Now you'll notice that this brush, because it's new, is quite stiff. Now what they do is they tend to put, they probably put gum arabic on them, and they make them kind of stiff so that they survive in transit and they're not getting bashed around. So the first thing you're going to want to do with a new brush like this is give it a good old bash in the water jar to get that gum arabic off. It won't have any effect on your painting, so don't worry about that. It's actually in the paints you buy anyway. So we're going to give that a good smash about on the bottom of the jam jar. Now don't be afraid to whack onto the bottom of the jam jar. As long as you're not leaving your brush standing in the water, it's not going to do it any harm at all. So we're going to get that brush ready to use. I'm going to go into the background, and I'm going to use cerulean blue and the yellow that I'm using for the butterfly, the cadmium yellow light. I'm going to start off by putting a bit of clean water. What I don't want is to have a visible mark where I start going around the butterfly. So I'm going to use the wet into wet technique I've shown you before. I've got other videos on that. I'll put them up in the information cards. Don't worry, if you click on those cards, you won't go away from this video. It just means that you can watch that video after this one. And what I'm going to do is start putting some colour on with this little flat brush. Now, although it's a little brush, it's not actually so small as to not hold any weight. So I'm impressed so far with the amount of water and the amount of body that I'm able to get with this. So as I said, I'm going to start going in. I've got some yellow here. Now the butterfly is going to be that yellow, so I don't want the background to look too yellow. So actually what we're going to do is adjust it by putting a little bit of the cerulean blue in it. and get this nice background going on. And I'm also going to put little bits of Payne's Grey in. I want to be careful with the Payne's Grey. I don't want to overdo it. It's a very dark colour. If I make it too dark, then this butterfly is not going to show up against the background. And you see this flat edge here allowing me just to go nicely around the butterfly. I'm going to work between those colours. The reason I'm using the same yellow that I'm going to use for the butterfly, not just some other random yellow, is because I like to work in a limited palette. Now, a limited palette doesn't mean you can only have, you know, 5 colours and it's very boring and you can't have any more colours. Doesn't mean anything like that. It just means that within each painting you work with as few colours as possible in order that everything kind of hangs together and looks nice and tonal and isn't jarring in any respect. Now, the amount of colours you need to use for each painting really is going to depend on the painting itself. If you're painting a garden and you've got a ton of beautiful brightly coloured flowers, then you're going to find that you need a lot of colours. But if you're painting a sunset landscape, you might only need 3 or 4 colours. So just judge it as you want, but do consider using some of those colours that you've already used elsewhere in the painting to put your background in. And so I'm going to now continue painting round here and finish painting this background. So that's the background finished. Of course, I could go on later on if I want to and put more things in, but I'm happy with it at the moment. And I was careful to sort of start up here and finish up here on clean water so that I didn't get a visible hard edge where I started going around the butterfly. You'll also notice that I worked methodically from one side to the other, just minimize the amount of drying lines I've got. Now my background has dried and I'm ready to paint the next section. Now, before you start the next section, which will be painting the color on the butterfly, you want to do a couple of things. What you want to do is rub out some of this pencil around the outside edge, because you should only leave pencil on for as long as you need it. So once you no longer need that outside line because it's being defined by the background colour, you can get rid of all of that pencil and just leave the bits on that you need. Of course, make sure your paint is dry before you do that. You also want to change your water so that you haven't got any green in your water, and you'll make sure that any yellow that you're using on the palette hasn't got green in it either, because we don't want any green in our butterfly. We're just going to keep it to yellows and browns and blacks. So I've now got this brush here, which is a size 10 SAA Imitation Sable, and this is what they call a round brush. So it's a bit of a misnomer. A round brush actually has a pointed end, and you'll see that as well as it being sort of stuck together with the gum arabic, it comes with this plastic case on the end. Now you want to take that off. And beginners often make the mistake of trying to put these back on and try and keep their brushes nice, but it doesn't work. It normally just catches the little hairs. So you want to get rid of this, either use it for something else. You can even use it for making little marks in your paint, or just discard it. So I'm going to soften this brush before I use it. Now, although I don't use a flat brush, a small flat brush very often, this sort of size 10, size 12 brush, this is the brush that I use for the majority of my paintings. If you're only going to buy one good brush, make sure it's something like this. It's big enough to do anything, but it's small enough to have a nice fine point that you can get those fine details in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flood the butterfly wings one at a time with colour, and I'm going to put some little details on as well. So I'll show you how to do that. First of all, we're going to get that yellow again. Nice big puddle of wet paint, and I'm going to place it all across this area here. Now once you've painted your wing, the paint's still wet, and before it dries, what you're going to do is go straight in with some paint straight from the palette. So I've got this paint here that I've put some fresh out, but you can use it from a pan. If you've got pan paint like this, just put a tiny bit of water on. You're looking at using thick sticky paint with the minimum of water. And what we're going to do now is place it straight into that wet paint. Now, because the paint that's going on is thicker and stickier and less wet than the surface it's going on to, it won't spread any further than where you put it. So if you went on at this stage with drippy wet paint, it would probably go everywhere, but we're not going to do that. Just going to put some paint in the middle here and spread it outwards a little bit like this. If you find it's too wet, just take some tissue paper and dry your brush a little bit. And I just want to feather it out here. And then I'm going to leave it alone. So I'm going to go across the whole butterfly now. The ones I've been looking at have actually got some yellow on the body as well, so we're going to put some yellow on there that we can put dark on later on. And I'm going to continue painting this butterfly now, and then we'll skip ahead to the next step where we put the details on. As you can see, I've painted the yellow all over the butterfly now, and I've put the cadmium yellow deep into that colour while it was wet, so that I've got these soft edges here. So I've got these darker areas, but they're still soft. So this cadmium yellow deep, it's probably about as dark as you can get without going full on orange, but it's a really beautiful, really useful colour. And if you didn't have a yellow like this one, a sort of sunshine yellow, then you could possibly get a darker yellow like this one and add a tiny bit of it into your lemon yellow, and you should get a warmer shade of yellow that you can use. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change brushes again. I have to say this brush so far has been really good. It is not as springy as the one I normally use, which is a full-on synthetic brush. Although this is a thin synthetic brush, it really has much more of a natural animal hair feel to it, and it's fairly soft when it hits the paper, but it's not as soft as I was worried it might be. It's not completely floppy, because some animal hair brushes can just be completely floppy, and I find I've got no control with them. So it's certainly a lot more usable than that. And it seems to hold water even better than some of my synthetic brushes. So it's a little bit softer, a little bit better at holding water. So the brush I'm going to use next is this one here, and this is a rigger brush. Now I have to confess, I don't own a rigger brush. I've never really used one, but they're meant for long, thin lines. So I tend to use just a normal brush, maybe in a size 4, something like that, because I like the fact that it holds a lot of water. But since we're giving these a go, let's give the rigger a go. So I'm going to dip it in the water and get rid of all the gum arabic that sort of pulled it together. And what I'm going to do is use this colour here. So this colour is sepia. Sepia varies between brands, but in the Talens Rembrandt it's a strong staining dark brown. Now I don't necessarily want it too dark, so I'm going to add just a little bit of water to that. And then what I'm going to do is add the lines to my butterfly's wings, these little lines here that are almost like veins on a leaf. So I'm going to pop those in using this long thin rigger brush. Now I believe that riggers were originally invented for literally painting the rigging on pictures of ships. So there we are, and it's holding the colour well, and I'm not having to dip in before I get to the end of the line. Now it's really important when you do this stage that you've let the previous layer dry completely, because otherwise you're just going to find that this paint will bleed. So I'm going to now pop in all of those little veins. Now, having used a rigger for the first time, I think I kind of understand more about what they're for now. So what it really seems to be good for is making a very long, very narrow line, which would be suggested obviously by the shape of the brush, but I hadn't really appreciated the use of them before. So I found this really interesting. It's a really lovely brush. So what I'd advise you with a brush like this is, for goodness sake, if you've got a load of paint to mix up, if you need a really big puddle of paint, for goodness sake, use an old brush to mix up the puddle of paint, because this brush is quite delicate. You don't want to leave it standing in your water jar, and you certainly don't want to be scrubbing at paint with it. So if you're going to use a lovely brush like this, then I suggest you use an old brush for mixing if you need a big area of paint. Now the last brush that they have sent me is this one here, which again, I do have a brush like this actually. I have a synthetic brush like this. So this one is a size 0. It's really, really tiny, isn't it? So I rarely use a brush like this for little details. I tend to use watercolor pencils a lot, and I have used a brush like this. I think I used one, I was painting a squirrel years ago. I'll see if I can find a picture of it for you. I've used one for painting the whiskers on a squirrel. So this is a brush for tiny, tiny, fine details. So here we go with the Payne's Grey, and I'm going to start just getting some details, some tiny details on my butterfly's head and body. Now there's a strong danger here that these could just look a bit too harsh, because it's a really strong colour. So one thing you can do is just to get a piece of tissue paper and just to blot after putting on, and what will happen then is you'll get a much softer effect. So just putting the final touches on, and I'm using a little bit of Payne's Grey there. Payne's Grey is a great colour to use when you don't want to use black, so you want that real strength of colour without the cold, hard sort of deadness of black. And as I said, I've gone back to the size 10 brush. It may be that I'm a little bit lazy, but you know what? I do almost all of my painting with this size brush, this and some big flat brushes, but it's been really good fun trying out these other sizes too. Now, using the right brushes and the right materials is important, of course, but none of that will help you if you haven't got the techniques to go along with them. So if you find that you've started out with watercolours and you're just disappointed with the amount of mistakes that you make and how hard they are to rectify, I've got a great video you can watch. It's going to show you the most common watercolour mistakes and how you can correct them even after the paint has dried. You can watch that video right now.